Standing in downtown Los Angeles, looming over Skid Row, where homeless people and drug addicts eke by, stands a monolithic structure of brown brick and mortar. A classic 1920s awning shades the entrance for all who pass. It reminds visitors of an era gone by, the era the building was constructed in. On the side is painted an instantly recognizable sign with a blood red background. It says Hotel Cecil, low daily, weekly rates, 700 rooms. This hotel has been the site of some of the most infamous murders and suicides in American history. It has also served as home to some of the most notorious criminals to ever walk the earth. The Night Stalker Richard Ramirez was one. But did you know there is another serial killer who called the Cecil Hotel home? This is the story of Jack Unterweger, the Cecil Hotel Killer. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Johann Jack Unterweger was born in Steiermark, Austria. His mother was a Viennese prostitute, and he never knew his father, who was an American soldier who impregnated his mother after paying her for sex. So right off the bat, not even a paragraph into the story, we have not one, but two hallmarks of people who become violent later in life. We have the mother of a son who is overly sexual, who does not hide her sexuality from her son, and we have a totally absent father. We know that many men who become serial killers later in life often have domineering mothers, abusive mothers, or mothers who are overtly sexual in front of their children. Mothers who walk around scantily dressed or naked in front of their children. Mothers who have sex in rooms next door to their children so their children have to hear it. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, Bobby Joe Long, Charles Manson, Henry Lee Lucas, just to name a few. All had either prostitute mothers or overtly sexual mothers. Jack Unterweger grew up in extreme poverty. He lived with his abusive, alcoholic father in a one-room cabin. We're now 2 paragraphs into the story, and we have 4 hallmarks of people who become very, very violent later in life. The overly sexualized mother, the absent father, we have alcohol and substance abuse, and we have an abusive male figure. Jack Unterweger didn't even wait till he was an adult to be arrested. He was arrested several times as a teenager. For what? For beating up prostitutes. This is something we see all the time. Boys become angry at their own mothers, and so they beat up women who are in the same profession. This is the exact story of Charles Albright, the eyeball killer. He was given up for adoption by his prostitute mother, but the mother who raised him told him that his mother was a prostitute. The mother who raised him was also very overbearing. That can also be bad. Charles Albright's hatred for his mother stayed with him his entire life, and he ended up killing prostitutes. When Jack was in his early 20s, in 1974, he committed his first murder. He strangled 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer to death with her own bra. She was later found in the woods. Jack had dumped her there. People had seen Jack with Margaret, and so he was very quickly captured. He was arrested and he was put on trial. At the trial, Jack received a life sentence, and it's when he goes into prison that we really start to learn about him. When Jack Unterweger went into prison, he could not read or write. With nothing but time on his hands, he taught himself, and then he became a voracious reader. He read everything he could get his hands on. He really started to educate himself in prison, and then he began to write. When he did, a real talent emerged. Jack Unterweger had a natural gift for writing. His poems began to get passed around. First the prison psychiatrist, then some of the doctors started reading him, and they were like, these are good. Then Jack wrote an autobiography called Purgatory. This book became a bestseller. People in Austria and even in Germany, Switzerland, became fascinated with Jack Unterweger's life. They wanted to hear about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his alcoholic grandfather. They wanted to hear about his prostitute mother. In the book, Jack admits that he has committed numerous rapes and burglaries. He says he committed those crimes before he murdered Margaret. Jack also claims that he worked as a pimp, using women as a source of income. Again, very common. I hate prostitutes, but I'm going to use prostitutes. Jack's poems were considered so beautiful that they began to be taught in Austrian schools. I mean, hell almighty, we're banning To Kill a Mockingbird over here, and over there they got a serial killer writing poems, teaching them in the schools. Even Nobel Prize winners came forward and started praising this killer's work. Slowly, support began to grow for this sadistic killer. He was a model prisoner all throughout the 80s. People said he was not only kind, he was tender. Jack wrote, "I wielded my steel rod among the prostitutes of Hamburg, Munich, and Marseille. I had enemies and conquered them through my inner hatred." Jack talked about killing Margaret, and he said as he hit her over the head with an iron rod, he pictured the face of his mother. And this only made people find him more fascinating. Psychiatrists in prison diagnosed Jack with narcissistic personality disorder and psychotic tendencies. But sympathy for him continued to grow. Jack Unterweger comes up for parole, and by this time he had a flood of supporters. He had a lobby of prison reformists, writers, critics, professors, all championing the cause to get him released from prison. They claimed that he was reformed and that the tenderness and the expression of his writing proved he was a different person. We have to remember this was a while ago. Some of these pro-Jack Unterweger people were very powerful and they had sway. Even though Jack had been given a life sentence, he did only 16 years and then he was released. The prison said he was a success story. He had been reformed. They held Jack Unterweger up as this example for what can happen to a person in prison. On a petition signed by Jack's supporters was a statement that said, "Austrian justice will be measured by the Unterweger case." Well, that statement would definitely ring true, but not in the way they meant it. There were those that had misgivings. One of Jack's writings said, "No theme is more poetic than the death of a beautiful woman. You seem strange and distant and lively, death. But one day you will come, be close and full of flames. Come, lover, I am there. Take me, I am yours." I mean, I'm no poetry scholar, but really? When Jack was released, one of his supporters said, "We will never find a prisoner so well prepared for freedom." Oh, how wrong he was. This man went into prison an illiterate psychopathic murderer, pimp, rapist, killer, and came out the darling of the media, a character of fascination and danger. He was immediately welcomed into high society. Book launches and parties were held in his honor. He was stylish and handsome, and he was a criminal. His book, Purgatory, which is pronounced Fegefeuer in German, was even made into a film. Jack Unterweger, the killer, got a writing credit. He's on IMDb. Jack was living a life that anyone would dream of. He was going to fabulous parties, he was getting attention, he was getting fame, he was getting fortune, and he was also killing prostitutes. Jack Unterweger is living his life as a free man, a famous man, in fact. And then prostitutes started turning up dead. On September 15th, 1990, some people walking along the River Vltava in Czechoslovakia near Prague came across the horrific sight of the body of a young woman. Blanka Bakova was lying on her back, naked with a pair of gray stockings knotted around her neck. Her legs were positioned open in a vulgar fashion, and she was covered with leaves. Blanca had gone out the night before to have a drink with friends. She was last seen talking to a man around 11:45. Witnesses said the man was in his 40s, and they told the police that Blanca was not a prostitute. She was just a lady out having a drink. Several weeks later, Brunhilde Moser, a prostitute from Graz, went missing. This is not New York City. Prostitution is not viewed the same in Europe as it is in America. When this happened, the police became very concerned. 2 months later, in December, another prostitute, Heide Marie Hammerer, went missing. Her body was found on New Year's Eve in the woods by some hikers. Days later, Brunhilde Moser was discovered. She was badly decomposed, and she too had been left in the woods. Now remember, Blanca had disappeared from Prague, so Austrian police did not tie her murder to the others. The police did not yet know they were dealing with the same killer, but soon they would. On March 7th, 1991, Elfriede Schrempp vanished. She also disappeared from Graz. Her parents called the police to tell them that their daughter had disappeared, and they were receiving strange phone calls from a man who was calling them to taunt them about their daughter's profession. Elfriede's number was not listed, and so her parents felt that the man that was calling knew her. Either that or he had found her address book. They knew it had her phone number listed. On October 5th, months later, Elfriede's body was found in a wooded area outside Graz. Her remains were skeletonized, and she too had been covered in leaves. Then the police became convinced they were dealing with the same killer. People in the area became very concerned, but then things became much worse. Within a month's time, Sylvia Zagler, Sabine Moitzi, Regina Prem, and Karen Eroglu all vanished from the area. Sabine's body was discovered on the 20th of May, 1992. Karen was discovered a few days later. Both women had been strangled and dumped outside the city limits of Vienna. Just like the other victims, Sabine and Karen had been strangled with their own bras. The police could not seem to catch a break to find out even a clue as to who this killer might be. But then they got a call from a retired detective. 70-year-old August Schenner had worked a murder in the 1970s that rang a bell. August was calling the police to tell them, "I worked a murder in 1974 where the woman was strangled with her own bra." The woman was Margaret Schaefer, Jack Unterweger's first victim. Dr. Ernst Geiger, a detective for the Austrian Federal Police Force, was one of the naysayers when it came to Jack Unterweger. Geiger was never convinced that Jack had been reformed. Geiger believed that Jack had hoodwinked people. He never believed he had changed. So when Geiger spoke with this retired detective, he became convinced Jack Unterweger was back killing. Geiger ordered that surveillance be conducted on Jack. The police started watching him, but the problem was, at the time, Jack had gotten a job with an Austrian magazine, and they hired him to fly to Los Angeles and do a story on crime in LA. They hired a murderer to do a story on crime. The Austrian police did not have enough information to stop Jack from flying to America. But as soon as Jack left the country, the murder stopped. Now police had time to really start gathering some evidence. They knew Jack was going to come back eventually. With the killer in LA, they had time to go to work. The problem was Jack also had time to go to work, and he was living at the Cecil Hotel. Jack Unterweger arrives in Los Angeles. The focus of the article that he was supposed to write was about the crime rate in LA. He was specifically told to focus on the differences between US crime and European crime and the way police handled things differently in the US compared to Europe. It's just so insane to me. We've got a known killer of prostitutes, and they've hired him to write an article about crime. He's been let out of prison after only 16 years for killing a young woman, and they've hired him. This must be a European thing. As an American, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this. I mean, are we going to ask Michael Vick to write an article about dog breeding? Are we going to ask Bill Cosby to write an article about date rape? Like, what is happening here? Who thought this was a good idea? So it's the summer of 1991. We've got this serial killer loose in Los Angeles, and he goes right back to killing prostitutes. First, 35-year-old Shannon Exley disappears. Her body was found on June 20th, 1991 at 1020 South Fickett Street in the Hollenbeck area. She had been strangled to death with her own bra. Just 10 days later, the body of Irene Rodriguez, another prostitute, was found in an industrial area located at 130 South Meyer Street, again in the Hollenbeck area. She too strangled with her bra. 10 days after that, on July 11th, 1991, the body of Sherry Ann Long was found in the Corral Canyon area of Malibu. She had been strangled with her bra and dumped where she could be found. All three women in Los Angeles, Shannon, Irene, and Sherry, had been sexually assaulted with tree branches after and before being strangled with their own bras. Now, this tells us that the killer is most likely impotent. Back in 1991, DNA and biological evidence were not as helpful as they are now. I looked and looked for information as to whether or not semen was found on the bodies, and I could not find a yes or a no. But usually when a killer uses an object in that manner, it means that they are impotent. And I find this to be very interesting. Later on, it comes out that a psychiatrist earlier in Jack's life noted that it would be very possible he would become impotent later in life. This same psychiatrist is the one that diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and said that his hatred for women might drive him to kill. While Jack is in LA writing this story, he took great pleasure in interviewing police officers. He would approach them and tell them he was here from Austria. He had been sent to write about American cops. He'd kind of butter them up. And he took great pleasure in this little cat and mouse game, standing right in front of the faces of cops, knowing that he was a killer they were searching for actively. This was pre-internet. These cops had no idea. They couldn't look this guy up. They couldn't find out whether or not he was telling the truth. They couldn't find his prison record in Austria. Jack took great pleasure in rubbing this in the police's face. You know, he was right there under their noses and he loved it. The police had no idea that living at the Cecil Hotel was a serial killer. Now, this was 1991, but the Cecil already had a terrible reputation. It had a reputation for being haunted, for being dangerous, for being a desperate place for desperate people. Let's take just a moment and talk about the Cecil Hotel. Lots of strange things have happened there. I'm just going to go over some of the more famous ones. In 1931, 46-year-old W.K. Norton took poison capsules and killed himself inside his room at the Cecil. The next year, 25-year-old Benjamin Dodich shot himself in the head. In 1934, an Army sergeant named Louis D. Borden was found with his throat slashed. He left a suicide note. In 1937, Grace Margot was discovered wrapped in telephone wires after she jumped from the 9th floor. A year later, a 35-year-old Marine, Roy Thompson, jumped from his room and landed on the skylight of a nearby building. Navy officer Erwin C. Neblett poisoned himself in his room at the Cecil. In 1944, Dorothy Jean Purcell, only 19, claimed she didn't know she was pregnant and woke up in the night with stomach pains. She went to the bathroom and delivered a baby, which she then threw out the window of the hotel. Okay, that's... wow. In 1962, 65-year-old George Gianni was killed walking on the sidewalk below the Cecil when Pauline Ottens jumped from a window at the Cecil during an argument the couple was having. In 1964, a woman named Pigeon Goldie Osgood was found dead in her room at the Cecil. Goldie had worked as a telephone operator and she'd been living at the Cecil for quite some time. People called her Pigeon Goldie because she liked to feed the pigeons that are ever present at the hotel. A killer broke into her room, sexually assaulted her, stabbed her, and then strangled her. The Night Stalker Richard Ramirez lived at the Cecil off and on throughout 1984 and 1985. People claim Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, often stayed at the Cecil. And then, of course, there is the very notorious, unsolved, and strange death of Elisa Lam, found in the water tank on top of the Cecil Hotel in 2013. Paranormal investigators firmly believe that the Cecil is haunted. Haunted or cursed or both. I found Reddit threads where people posted claiming they had lived at the Cecil and some claiming they had worked at the Cecil. We know that there was one suicide at the hotel in 2020. The hotel really tries to keep this stuff out of the press now. In 2022, there was a man who died in his room. And the man, before dying, kept coming down to the front desk and saying that the lights in his room were turning off and on their own. The person that posted these events claims that they worked at the hotel and they're not really a paranormal believer, but that other people that work in the hotel are, and they're also very credible, rational people that claim to see a woman floating up the stairs, a woman in the hallway, guests report hearing voices in the hallway, opening their doors, no one is there. Some people report feeling very cold breezes as they're just, standing in their room. And a lot of people report smelling cigar smoke or very strong old-fashioned perfume when they're alone. I read one thread where somebody claims they were staying at the Cecil and all night somebody was knocking on their door and they would run to the door and open the door and there was nobody in the hallway. Whatever you believe about the Cecil, there is no doubt it is part of American lore. I would absolutely love to visit. I tried to get my husband to let me go last time we were in LA, and he was just like, I am not parking our car and coming back to have the thing stripped and everything stolen out of it. We are not going to Skid Row in LA. Sorry. He's like, I will do a lot of things for you. We are not going to the Cecil. For someone like Jack Unterweger, this place was perfect. It was cheap. It was downtown and it had plenty of prostitutes in the area. Jack stayed at the Cecil, he finished his article, and then after murdering 3 women, he got on a flight and he went home to Austria. Now remember, as Jack is living in Los Angeles, Dr. Geiger is investigating these murders back in Austria. Geiger traced Jack's movements via credit card receipts, telephone calls, car rental agency receipts. And after months of this, the detective had put together a very solid timeline of Jack's movements. They lined up with when the women disappeared, they lined up with when the women were found dead, and they lined up with what witnesses told them. Witnesses came forward and said, I saw this woman with a man that looks like Jack Unterweger. The police also had proof that Jack had been in Vienna when Karen disappeared. Dr. Geiger got a warrant to examine Jack's BMW that he had left in Austria when he went to LA. In that BMW, Dr. Geiger found a hair and it had a root on it. Even back then, with the rudimentary DNA testing, they were able to prove that the hair belonged to Blanka Brakova. She was the first victim in Prague. This evidence from Jack's car was enough to get them a warrant to get into his apartment, his flat. There, they discovered a brown leather jacket and a red scarf, and they took these to the witnesses that had seen a man with the prostitutes. They said, is this the jacket? Is this the scarf? And the witnesses said, yes, absolutely. The man was wearing that jacket and that scarf. After Jack came back, the police were still going into his apartment. I don't know if they were doing it covertly or if Jack knew they were there. But Dr. Geiger found a receipt from a restaurant, a seafood restaurant in Malibu. And he also found all these photographs that Jack had taken with the LA cops, specifically female cops. Dr. Geiger contacts the Los Angeles police and asked, did you have any prostitutes murdered from this date to this date? And they said, in fact, we did. 3. Dr. Geiger said, were they strangled with their own bras? The police said, yes, they were. The police in Los Angeles told Dr. Geiger the details of the murders. Everything was matching up. Jack Unterweger had gone to Los Angeles masquerading as a journalist. I guess he did actually write an article, but while he was there, he was still killing. His receipts from the Cecil put him smack dab on Skid Row on the dates that all the prostitutes that were known to work in that area vanished. Dr. Geiger knew that Jack Unterweger was his killer, but there was something very pressing at hand. Jack had begun dating a very young and naive woman named Bianca Mrak. Bianca was now missing. The cops went to Bianca's home several days in a row, and she was not there. They were panicked and they were worried that they had another victim on their hands. The problem was, when the cops went looking for Bianca, they tipped Bianca and Jack off that they were onto him. Bianca was actually fine. She was with Jack. The two of them fled Austria and went back to America. And as soon as they get there, Jack goes on this media crusade talking about how the Austrian police are persecuting him because of his past criminal record. He said he was being wrongly accused for murders he did not commit just because they were similar to the one murder he had committed. Well, yeah, that's actually a pretty good place to start. Some Austrian papers even paid Jack to give them interviews over the phone. People were fascinated with this case. Bianca came forward and said she was safe and happy and well. She didn't believe Jack was dangerous. Now, the fact that Jack and Bianca had entered the U.S. under false pretenses, they lied on their passports, that made them eligible for arrest. The U.S. Marshals went out looking for Jack and Bianca. They were also keeping surveillance on Bianca's mother back in Austria because she was very close with her mother. They had Bianca's mother's phone tapped, and Bianca calls her mother and asks her mother to wire money to a Western Union place in America. So Bianca appears at this Western Union location and the U.S. Marshals are waiting. Jack was waiting outside, but something spooked him and he ran. The Marshals chased him through a restaurant, through the kitchen, and then they cornered him in an alleyway. He was taken down and handcuffed. The cops would later say that when they told Jack he was wanted for murder in Austria, he started to cry. The cops went to the apartment in America where Bianca and Jack had been staying. There, they found evidence linking Jack to some of the murders, and they also found his diary in which he wrote that he was planning to kill Bianca. When Jack was in custody, faced with all of the evidence against him, he said, well, I want to go to trial in California first. But then he found out about the death penalty. So then he said, no, I'll go back to Austria and be tried there first. I'm not really sure why he got to choose. That seems odd to me. So Bianca and Jack are extradited back to Austria. And I hope Bianca realizes what a lucky woman she is. The plane carrying this serial killer lands on Austrian soil. Jack immediately begins talking to the press, saying, why would I ruin my life? Why would I start killing again? I had this wonderful life. I was making money. I was kind of famous. Well, because you're a psychotic killer. That's why. Before Jack's trial began in Austria, Dr. Geiger and a man named Thomas Mueller went to America. They wanted to study with FBI agents from Quantico and learn from them. They were preparing for the trial. They spent time with FBI profilers here and learned about serial killers' MO, their patterns, their behaviors. When Geiger and Mueller showed the FBI agents the crime scenes, the FBI agents were instantly very interested in the knots that Jack used around his victims' necks. It was a very specific type of knot, and he had used it on every single victim. This was more evidence for them to use at trial, and they went back to Austria very prepared. In June of 1994, Jack Unterweger went on trial in Graz, Austria. He was on trial for the murders in Prague and Austria, but also for the murders in LA. I'm not sure how that works in Austrian law, how you can try someone out of your jurisdiction, but apparently there you can. Jack proved himself to be a prolific liar. He was also an excellent manipulator. Jack told the judge and jury, I'm a rat. I consume women rather than love them. The defense attorneys were not prepared for what Geiger and Mueller had gathered in America. They had profiles, they had analysis from FBI agents, and then they had this information about the knots. Jack Unterweger's supporters that had helped get him out of prison in the 70s realized they had been fooled. They had made a terrible mistake. Jack Unterweger wasn't a changed man. He was every bit the monster he had always been. When it was all said and done, on June 29th, 1994, Jack Unterweger was found guilty. He was found guilty of 9 counts of murder, the Prague victim, all 3 in Los Angeles and 5 in Australia. The court sentenced Jack to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the same night, 6 hours after being found guilty, Jack removed his shoelaces and the cord from the waistband of his sweatpants. He fashioned a rope and hung himself in his jail cell. He used the same knot he had used on all his victims. When Peter Humer, one of Jack's most loyal defenders, found out, he said, "At the time, I genuinely believed Unterweger was a reformed man, but now I feel I was deceived. I feel I was partly to blame." I second that. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Please hit the like button, subscribe if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. Some people give a few dollars a month to help keep the episodes coming, and you can also be a part of our fundraiser. There's a video on my channel just called Fundraiser. It's a couple minutes long, and it explains everything we are doing to try and solve some cold cases. Again, you can listen to my podcasts. I have Dining with Death. I have Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee, and they are both on Apple and Spotify. I hope you're doing well. I sure appreciate each and every one of you. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.